Hello, I'm Kiri Inglis from bookshop.org, and I am very pleased to introduce Esther Freud and Alexandra Pringle in conversation to celebrate Bloomsbury at 35 and I Couldn't Love You More in paperback. Esther Freud trained as an actress before writing her first novel, Hideous Kinky, which was made into a film starring Kate Winslet. And after publishing her second novel, Peerless Flats, Gurnah chose her as one of their best of young British novelists, along with Kazuo Ishiguro and Jeanette Winterson. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and I Couldn't Love You More is her 9th novel. Alexandra Pringle has been editor-in-chief at Bloomsbury for 23 years. In that time, she's published some of the best writers in print today, and she has just been named Editor of the Year at the British Book Awards. Alexandra.
Thank you so much. It's such a huge pleasure to be here, to be doing this, particularly doing this for independent booksellers who we all love. I love it that Bloomsbury is an independent company, and I think independence is an all-round extremely important thing. There are many years being celebrated here. One is that Bloomsbury is 35 years just this year, and we've published this anthology, which includes Esther, to celebrate that. But many, many years between Esther and me that date before my time at Bloomsbury, which has been only 23 of the 35 years. So Esther and I met in 1991, a very snowy February. Soon after, her agent, a friend of both of ours called Alexandra Pringle, had sent me the manuscript, and she just rang me and said, please, I know you're going to love this book, and can I post it through your front door, which was a slightly eccentric thing for an agent to do. And there it was waiting for me when I went home, and I will never forget the experience of reading the manuscript of Hideous Kinky and literally falling in love with it from the first paragraph. And it was to do with the voice that Esther has and has had in all her fiction, the way that she writes with such clarity and precision and gentle beauty of the best sort, and an understanding of the human heart and human lives. So Esther, tell me about your journey to that moment when we met.
Well, first of all, congratulations, Alexandra. I didn't realize that you'd been made Editor of the Year. How just completely wonderful. I hope that that's not the first time that you've been made Editor of the Year, many years, but anyway, it's still just a wonderful honor and so suitable. It's funny to think of Zandra putting the manuscript through your door, because I had only a few nights before put the manuscript through her door, and it all felt so sort of, for me, so unbelievably important. It's such a huge dividing point in my life, sort of before and after. You know, you sometimes don't realize when things happen that they're going to be so important, but actually I was sort of aware that I had been an actress, and I'd found it was a sort of strange anxiety consuming life. And once I started to write, which I did quite secretly, because I didn't think anything much would come of it. So in that year that it took me to write Hideous Kinky, I had this private space. And as the year passed, I realized that it was fueling me and nourishing me in a way that the things that I'd done before hadn't. And so putting it through that door felt sort of also quite private. And I sort of ran away, terrified someone might see me. And it's a strange thing as a writer that you are so private, and then a book is published and it becomes so public, and then your voice is out there in the world, which has been your own very personal voice, because this was such a personal story to me. And that first day of meeting you and sitting in that room with you and Zandra, it felt as if it was the first time that someone had really heard my private voice made public. It was such a special snowy February afternoon, as you described it.
It was incredibly special. And as a publisher, when you buy a debut novel, you have so many fears. You can't, you hope you don't transmit to the author, but you always worry about whether your passion is going to be shared by the outside world. And so the moment when you're waiting for the reviews, you're holding your breath. And I will always remember that there was a review in the Times Literary Supplement by Gabrielle Annan, who's a tremendously distinguished critic. And she wrote this line, she said, "It has the art that conceals art." And I thought, everything is going to be all right. They get it. But that was the beginning of a writing career in which you've mined your own life and your family's life. And your family is a very extraordinary family. So did you always know that that is what you would want to do?
I didn't really have any thoughts beyond what was happening just then. Certainly I knew what was really interesting for me psychologically about writing that first novel, set in my own childhood, was that it was as if I'd had a sort of a kind of gauze in front of my eyes, because it fell away. And suddenly I had so many ideas for stories, and I saw that there were so many wonderful possibilities for creating novels out of incidents from my life, things that I had been interested in, kind of episodes and thoughts and places. Whereas until then, I just had that story, and it was as if it was taking up all my thoughts, and it needed to be got out of the way in order to free me as a writer. So I did, I think, very, very quickly start writing my second novel, which was also very much rooted in my life. But then with my third novel, I think I thought, oh, I can do this thing, this writing thing. And I rather over ambitiously started on writing, as you know, Alexandra, nearly killed me, a novel set in 1914 in Germany in the First World War, based on the idea of my father's mother's very sort of bourgeois German Jewish family, very patriotic, about which I knew absolutely nothing. But I thought I could sort of spin it in the way that I'd spun stories from, say, my very early childhood, which of course I didn't actually remember that much. But I hadn't quite realized how, even though I couldn't really remember it, it was inside me. Whereas my father's stories, that he was pretty loath to divulge, weren't really inside me. But after 4 years of absolute backgrinding work, they became inside me, and it strengthened me as a person. So all my books have sort of cost a lot and given me so much back.
That's really interesting, because I think that this new book, and here is the beautiful, beautiful paperback jacket. I think it's come out inside out, back to front. So it was actually published in hardback last year, and it's just being published now in paperback. But this, in a way, is a culmination, isn't it, of how you've threaded family stories and ideas that come out of your family, but that it's not your family, and yet there's your family there. So could you just describe a little bit what the construct of the book is and the three voices that you have?
I mean, yes, you're right. This is a really good example of how I need something to feel as if it's my own story, really personal to me. But ultimately, this story has, the first third is based in some ways on my own family story. And then, of course, it goes off into huge depths of fiction. I started with the idea of wanting to write about love. And I took, really for ease, I was so eager to get on with all the things I had to say about love, that I took my grandmother, my mother, and myself in our own sort of historical place. So I started by writing about the sort of beginning of a relationship where a couple meet just before the Second World War, as my own grandparents did in London. My grandmother was a girl from County Cork, and then I started to sort of tell and reimagine that story. Of course, I think most people feel this, if only that you'd asked your grandparents. Really, the stories that interest you as you're older. I remember thinking, I just can't think of anything to say to my Nana. Now, of course, I can think of 100 things that I would like to ask her and discuss with her. And then I took someone of my own generations of struggling with a relationship and the kind of pressures of modern life and the sort of perfectionism that we have about raising children now. I took someone of my mother's generation in the late 50s, living in the bohemian world of artists and the French house and the Gargoyle Club. And that's when I really started to think about the fact that my mother, and this is really at the heart of the novel, that my mother had as she'd been raised a Catholic and she'd sort of found herself in this bohemian world where she was pregnant, not married, with an older man, as my father was, and as the artist in the novel is, although I made him a sculptor. And I thought about what she might have done and what so many young Catholic, Irish raised girls did do, which was to go to their family, go to their local priest and see what help they could get, which led me into the enormous task of discovering what really went on in the mother and baby homes that were set up in England and in Ireland, and reading all sorts of absolutely harrowing accounts of life incarcerated in these places where often you had to stay for up to 3 years. But I did discover that, especially in the Irish ones, in some of them, the one that was just outside Cork, where I imagined my character would have ended up, was that if someone would pay £100, which is the equivalent of about £2,000 now, you could leave after 10 days. And as I was writing this book, and I've really worked on it for a long time, years, I never knew who it was going to come up with the £100. And I used to think, who is it going to be? And it was almost as if I was the reader. I was absolutely, compelled forward in the story to try and work out who. And then it became so clear. It's as if it's the most tightly plotted part of the novel. Obviously, and I won't give it away for anyone who hasn't read the book, the character who comes with the £100 is so important that that's what happens, and shows a side of his character that reveals a lot about the whole book and the structure of love and relationships and sort of betrayals, but also loyalty.
And there's so many different sorts of love. There's sexual love, romantic love, but there's also love between mothers and daughters. And of course, Kate has the situation that she's adopted, and she needs to find out who her mother is. And is there one particular kind of love that propelled you the most in the writing of this?
Well, the love that I was most interested in was actually I realized, encapsulated so many types of love. So I was really interested in the romantic love that you choose for yourself and the way it's born out of the love that you were nourished by as a child. So it gave me a chance to investigate familial love and the love in the family and the way it can be broken and sort of disconnected. And then the relationships you choose for yourself as an adult. And so I really looked at all these, and it showed really then I was looking at sort of all types of love, although I didn't focus as much on sort of love between friends as I have done in other books, and as certainly I feel is so vitally important in my own life. I did go down that road for a little bit, and I thought, we just cannot have any more characters in this book, because I'm telling 3 storylines, 3 whole families. Obviously, there's how all these 3 women are connected, and it's not entirely clear, which is part of the suspense. And having an adoption story at the heart of a book, immediately you're in a sort of detective frame of mind. And I interviewed various people I knew anyway who'd been adopted, and it was so useful and interesting. And
yes,
I used a lot of what they told me in my book.
Did you?
Mm.
And did you feel that that an adopted child is very different from one who isn't? Did you feel that was central to Kate's life?
I suppose, I think of the 4 people I interviewed specifically, who I used most of what they, who the most useful interviewers, they were as different as any people are.
Mm.
But I felt that there was a capacity for yearning that I wanted to look at, because I have a great capacity for yearning. And I remember talking actually to wonderful Michelle Roberts once and saying, oh gosh, just seemed to be in a continual state of yearning. And she went, don't knock it. I got 3 novels out of yearning. So I thought, good, I'm getting this one. So people are yearning in different ways for things that they need to fill themselves. But I think Kate is yearning for love in a very, very fundamental way.
Mm. And certainly 2 of your women are not fulfilled in their yearning by men, are they?
No, I think that looking for fulfillment from one relationship is a danger anyway, but it's certainly compelling and certainly worth dissecting. And you always hope that someone will fulfill absolutely all your yearning. But I think if you've got a sort of empty space in you that hasn't been filled up by someone else, that's always going to be rife with problems. So curious about all of these things. And I realized that even though love has come into my other novels, it's never been the central preoccupation. And so I really wanted to make it, although actually, even though I didn't start this novel with any idea of a plot, it became very heavily plotted because there is a search and
yes.
there is a lot of answers and questions that have to be put together. And so actually, after a while, I forgot all about love and was just trying to find a way to bring these many-stranded story to a culmination.
Yes. And I think that I'm interested in the way that you talk about motherhood in it, because motherhood does change through the generations as women's lives change. Did you set out to think about that, or did that appear on its own?
I didn't think about that initially, but I started to think about that quite quickly, because I really thought about the way my grandparents had raised their children and how ambitious they were for them, having come from really hard-working families, quite poor families. They wanted their children to escape the privations that they'd been born into during the Second World War, rationing and the sort of hardness of life. And they, they believed that even if they had to send them off to boarding school age 4 and 7, as was the case, that, it would be worth it because they'd have an education, they'd make something of themselves. And then my mother's generation wanted to throw off all the sort of tyranny of what they saw as being told what to do from morning to night, and to be free. And
that's by now we're into the 60s, aren't we?
Into the 60s,
yes.
And into the sort of what is then the background of my first novel, Hideous Kinky, where when I wrote that novel, I wasn't a mother. And I remember years later rereading it for, I think, maybe book club, and thinking, gosh, I was very hard on my mother. If I was writing this now, I'd write a very different kind of texture to it.
Yes.
So the mother's always, being cross and doing this and crying, or, being sort of slightly flippant. Whereas now I think, gosh, she was trying to do all this with 2 small children. I know what that's like. And, you only write the book you write at the time you write it. It would be different at any time. But it was nice to go back to that background and actually see where she'd come from, and see that she, the character, in a way, obviously it made me think of how I'd used my mother's character before. This one, she changes quite quickly from the very feisty and independent woman that my mother was to someone caught up, although she keeps those characteristics, she gets caught up in a really horrifying world where she has no freedom.
But then there is that lovely passage in Shamsie, when she finds freedom against one of my favourite bits in the book. It's very Girls of Slender Means.
I actually found a short story that my mother wrote that had the heart of that in. It's not something she had ever mentioned to me. And the story was a group of girls who lived rent-free in a house of a man who let them live there if they would have supper with him on different nights of the week. And I thought, I just have to use this. So that's where Rosaline spends some of her time. And I was just delighted to be able to somehow really harness my mother's creativity. And she did write short stories and poems and memoir. And that was a real pleasure. And I'm so glad you loved that.
I absolutely love it. And it's interesting because it is like a short story. It's like a story of its own, and it's so full of atmosphere. And I sometimes just like go and look at it on its own, just to be there. And partly as well because I live in Chelsea and grew up here through that period. So it has. It's very atmospheric.
The idea of this big dilapidated house, and he just loved having these chirruping young women around. I must go back and look at it, I mean, it's almost unrecognizable from the original, but it had a rather amazing sort of political side, that one of the girls came back in, she had become an activist. I can't remember exactly, but I took the heart of it anyway.
And then I remember you saying the other day, which was so extraordinary, you have this wonderful scene of your parents or your two characters meeting in Soho, and then out of it you met somebody who got in touch with you who was there, and that happened.
Yes.
In your life.
No, I think, as I've said, my father didn't like to divulge much personal information. He hated a direct question, and my mother was very unsentimental, and her feelings about the past were pretty complicated, I think. So between the two of them, I didn't get much information about the past, but I'd always imagined that they'd met at the French, as we called it now, the French House, a wonderful pub in Soho. And so I created my characters, Rosaline and Felix, and I have them meeting in Soho, and that's the moment where the spark between them is really born. And but then someone read the book and told their mother about it, and their mother said, "Oh, I was with Esther's parents when they first met, and it was apparently at a club called the Le Cave de France." And she said that he had asked if he could paint her because he admired her frog eyes. And she said, "No way." But then she said, "But your mother was more interested." And even though we warned her against him, she became totally infatuated and fell in love with him.
So wonderful. So, but you made the male character a sculptor rather than a painter, which of course is what your father was. Why did you do that?
I was really intrigued by the idea. Well, what I really wanted to show, that I wanted to write about an artist who's completely caught up in their world and their creativity, to the point where they can't really take on any other responsibility. And it's actually, the title comes from Felix saying to Rosaline that he couldn't love her more, at a point in the book where he feels very tenderly towards her. But because of his art and his compulsion, not just to paint, as my father did, but to actually chip away at a block of stone and find what it is revealing inside, I felt that I wanted to show how he couldn't love anyone more than he can, that he is limited by his compulsion to create, but also by his own background, his own childhood. He was a refugee from the war, and has a very complicated relationship with his own mother. I just touch on very lightly in the book. But I also wanted to write about that in conjunction with Kate, who is an artist as well. She doesn't know where she's inherited her artistic talent. She eventually, we hope, will discover this. But she also has a compulsion to be creative, but it's mixed with her duty and her desire to be a really good mother, because she's a mother in the early 90s, when to be a good mother is, a huge tick, and you never feel you've quite done enough, and you wouldn't send your child off to boarding school at 4 or take them on a trip around, Europe or North Africa, because you're trying to sort of fulfill what everyone in society feels is a good mother. So she's sort of burdened by that. So she's always trying to find moments to write. And actually, it made me think a lot about why there are so few really successful women artists who have children. And it's just very rare for a female artist to be able to put the rest of her life to one side to the extent where she can reach the top of her game. And it's something I'm also really interested in. And I wanted to play with this idea in the book.
I think it's extremely difficult. And in fact, the artist who painted this picture, Gillian Ayres, had 2 sons. She would talk about having to go into her studio at midnight and painting through the night, and then taking her sons to school the next day. The physicality of it does make it different.
And I talked to Celia Paul about, and she is probably one of the few contemporary women artists who has a child, whose her work is in the Tate. She had her own shows selling out, and she said it's a daily practice, and that you have to do it all every day, and you have to have nothing else in your mind. And if there's a child even in the next room, it makes it impossible. Whereas I think why I felt so lucky and blessed to have been a writer is I always knew I wanted children. And I always knew I wanted to have several lives. I wanted to have a writing life and a life with my children. And acting, which is how I began, would have made that very difficult because you have to go away or you have to commit to a huge long job or be out every night for months on end. Whereas writing, you can somehow keep both things in your head because there's so many examples of writers who've managed it.
I always remember when I met you, you were still acting.
Yeah.
And I remember going to see you in a play in Finborough Arms, and I found it really difficult because you were a refugee and you were attacked and on stage, and I felt absolutely outraged for you, wanted to go and hit the man. I couldn't separate it. Anyway, I always remember you saying what you liked about writing was that you were in control of your life in a way that you're not as an actor.
Yes, it was honestly like a sort of light bulb going off because I had thought since age about 12 that I wanted to be an actress. Why I can't imagine where I even got the idea from. We didn't even have a television. I hardly ever went to the theatre, but I think it was the idea, the allure, almost like being in the circus, of sort of being part of a tribe, having a kind of family that's ready-made, being and doing something that didn't involve studying or sitting in a room writing, which is funny, seeing as that's what I actually discovered I most loved doing. So I had this idea, a very fantastical idea, but it wasn't till I started writing that I realized it hadn't actually made me as happy as I thought it was going to. And you don't always know what's right for you when you make decisions so early. And writing, I was able to start when I wanted, and I was able to stop when I wanted. I didn't have to wait for someone to call me up and say, you got the job. You know, you made the job.
Yeah, I always remember you called me one day, and it was before mobiles, from a call box, and you said, I've just been waiting to have an audition, and I thought I'd go and have a walk, and I've just walked too far to get back to the audition. And I felt that was the moment when you shut the door on acting.
That's right. I think I had the door open for a year or so. I thought, well, I could write and then get an acting job and do both, and it would be rather sort of marvelous to have both lives. But it was only then when they said, oh, as they often said, running a bit late, and you sort of sit there with all the other actresses waiting, hearing some mournful voice from the room, and someone saying, well, could you just try it a bit different, or imagine you're a palm tree, or I don't know, whatever. Just sit there, and I just walked and walked and walked, and I walked all the way home, and I just realized I was never going back. And then my agent obviously was not pleased, and that was the end of it. Hallelujah.
And your great friend from drama school ended up as a novelist too.
Yes, my friend Kitty Aldridge, who, when we first were young actresses, we wrote together, and that was such a happy time. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll be in a writing team, but ultimately it turned out I really had to just write on my own. And yeah, so lucky. So
when, looking at all the whole body of your work, the amazing body of your work, as we were saying earlier, a lot of them come out of your life in some way, and I think there's a real kinship to writers like Jean Rhys and Rosamund Lehman, who write so well about the female heart in particular, and people's interior lives, and how life sort of buffets you around, and how you might appear to be passive, but you're not so passive underneath. But then the novel that we've actually got in our anthology, Bloomsbury at 35, is a completely different one. It's Mr. Mac and Me. But it has, I think, two things. It's a novel that's around the life of the amazing artist Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So, of course, there are two things. One is landscape in your work, and that's another thing which we haven't touched on, can be very, very important, particularly East Anglia, particularly Suffolk, where I live a lot of the time. But also, of course, Charles Rennie Mackintosh is an artist. But what inspired you to write that?
Well, books often come out of other books, and I've had a few books that have sort of bred other books that have just come from them. And my third novel that I mentioned, Being So Difficult in Germany, out of that book, because I got sent so many incredible memoirs and pieces of information because of that book. Out of that book came The Sea House, which was about, in some ways, refugees, but it was set in Suffolk. And then out of that book, which Suffolk people particularly took to their heart, somebody said, oh, you should write another book set in Suffolk. Did you know that Charles Rennie Mackintosh, just before the First World War, arrived in Walberswick, this little village where I spent so much time, and he stayed when everyone left. When the war was declared, it was such a dangerous part of East Anglia where everyone imagined an invasion would land, that if there was going to be an invasion, it would be there. And but he didn't leave, and he and his wife, the artist Margaret MacDonald. Margaret, gosh, it's so long since that is her. And since his so he and his wife, the artist Margaret MacDonald, they stayed, and they created so much suspicion among the local people who didn't really understand their Glaswegian accents. They thought that maybe they were spying. They found Charles Rennie Mackintosh was a deeply eccentric person who would wander the countryside with a pair of binoculars, staring out to sea, examining tiny flowers. Everybody became more and more suspicious, and there were all these posters put in the local, outside the local town hall, saying, loose words cost lives, and beware of your, no one's safe. Listen to, keep an eye out for your neighbours. Watch, basically, do not trust anybody. And they fell foul of this, and ultimately, he was arrested. And he'd been corresponding with a German art critic who wanted to publish a book of his watercolours, because he was also an artist and had become an architect, really, because his father felt there was not ever going to be any money in art. But it was a very dramatic moment in his life in Suffolk. And I remember thinking, it is a wonderful story, but it's not my story. And I quite do have that, and I'm sure writers often get told this story, saying, oh, here's a good story for you, and your heart sinks a bit because however good a story it is, if it's not your story, it's very hard to find a way into it. But then I realized that the house I lived in at the time used to be the local pub, and when a bigger pub had been built, it had been taken down and moved in a wheelbarrow, brickload by brickload, to a little site further up the village, and rebuilt exactly as it was, as a cottage. And slowly it had come down through the generations, and I'd ended up living there. And the man I'd bought the house from had left a sort of history of the house. And one of the things he'd left was the fact that Charles Rennie Mackintosh often stayed in the pub, therefore in that house. And so I started to imagine that he was in the house, and that he was being suspicious and strange during the First World War, staying in the pub. And then I thought, this is my story, because I'm walking up these stairs that he walked up. I'm sitting by this fire where he smoked his pipe. I started doing lots of research. I went to Glasgow. I discovered so many things about him that suddenly seemed so important, and as if they were somehow my discoveries. And actually very little about him personally had ever been written. I don't know if there was anything fictional, and there was one biography that was helpful, but not very much, mostly sort of books about his architecture. So I loved writing that book because I loved being in Suffolk